Hi, everyone. Welcome to my sermon today. Our scripture is going to be the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verses 27 to 37. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made." But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. The word of God for the people of God. So we've been spending this series of sermons in a grouping of teachings from Jesus. And some of you might be wondering at this point, where is the forgiveness? Where is the cross? Where is the gospel? And those are good questions. And they're really important questions. Because if we don't encounter these teachings as forgiven people, if we don't come to these teachings knowing that we are forgiven by Jesus, then we're already starting off on the wrong foot. And if we don't approach these teachings with our eyes on Jesus crucified on the cross, then we will be blind to what Jesus is actually saying. But at the same time, if we think that these teachings are not part of the gospel, then we are deceived. Clearly they are included in the four different gospels. These are part of Jesus' life. These are part of what Jesus came to do. So if we think these teachings are not part of the gospel message, then we are missing out on the full gospel. But here's the thing. You see these teachings, Jesus intends them to be for his followers and for his disciples. For anyone who counts themselves saved by Jesus. So for those of us who are saved by Jesus' atoning sacrifice on the cross, and we who are saved by Jesus' resurrection from the grave, these teachings are intended for us. And for anyone who has received Jesus' grace and mercy, for those of us who were guilty and undeserving when Jesus freely offered us forgiveness, and we who have received this forgiveness and repented from our sin and turned towards Jesus, if that's us, then these teachings are intended for us. And for anyone who has chosen to follow Jesus and call him Lord, for those of us who have become students of life, and we who have turned to Jesus to learn a better way to live, these teachings are intended for us. If you don't fit into any of these groups, well, Jesus, he invites you to listen. He invites you to if you're interested, come and hear what he has to say. But that's it. No command. But for those of you who count yourselves saved and forgiven and disciples, well, Jesus commands you to listen and to try to obey, and he plans to help you obey. So with that laid out, right now, either as interested listeners or as forgiven followers, let us now approach Jesus' teaching on divorce. Now, the New International Version of the Bible, which is what I read from, it translates this: "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, there's something going on here that I think we would all be surprised by. I was surprised by it. You see, this translation, this NIV, it says that the divorced woman, the divorced wife, is a victim of adultery. But in the original language, it doesn't actually say that. Instead, the Greek says that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality on her part, causes her to commit adultery. So it pretty much says that she becomes an adulteress, which I was not expecting. But then here's maybe an even more surprising thing. Read the text closer, and what does it say the woman does to commit adultery? Does it say she sleeps with another man? No. Does it say she marries another man? No. Does it say she decides to get divorced? No. It just says that if her husband decides to divorce her, she commits adultery. It's like, what? And then here's yet another surprising thing about what Jesus says here, or rather, it's what Jesus doesn't say. So Jesus says that this woman commits adultery just by suffering a divorce. And then any man who might marry her also commits adultery. But what about the first husband? Right? What about that guy who chose to divorce her? Isn't he committing adultery too? Apparently not. Or at least Jesus doesn't say so, which that's surprising, right? It doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. So what's actually going on here? Now this teaching, I think it does offer some clues as to what's really going on. But I'm actually going to move us to a later point in Matthew where this topic of divorce comes up again, because I think that hits the nail on the head even more. So I'm going to be reading from Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 10. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," Jesus replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry." Okay, so there's a lot there. We can't get into everything. I can't even explain everything. I have a bunch of questions myself. But let's go ahead and start out with the Pharisees' initial question. They said, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" And this, you might not know this, but this is actually an invitation for Jesus to wade into one of the big Jewish rabbinical debates of his time. So you see, back in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, the Israelites are told, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. And now if it sounded like that sentence wasn't over, that's because it wasn't. It's part of a longer law, but this first verse in particular was focused on, and the meaning of it debated. Is this saying divorce is allowed if she becomes displeasing to him, so long as he gives her a certificate of divorce? And if so, what counts as this displeasing or indecent something that he has found about her? And so in this debate, there are three major rabbis, or at least their disciples, who are weighing in. And so the disciples of Rabbi Shammai said that a man should not divorce his wife unless he suspects her of adultery. But then the disciples of Rabbi Hillel, well, they said that he may divorce her even if she has merely burnt his dish. So I want you to hear this. Husbands, if your wife makes one mistake, maybe she toasted your bread too long or didn't put enough butter on it, well, this rabbi would say you are allowed to divorce her. But then a third rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, he comes along and he says that she didn't even have to do anything wrong. It could just be that he finds another woman more beautiful than she is, in which case he is allowed to divorce the one and marry the other. And so clearly Jesus sides with the first, with Rabbi Shammai. And I hope it is clear to us why Jesus would side with him. Like these second two rabbis, they were respected and they were looked up to by their fellow Jews and by other rabbis even. And they even had their own reasons for interpreting this passage this way. But just think about it. Like, how terrible is this to women? Wives must always be afraid about messing up and afraid their husbands will go the route of Hugh Hefner and trade them in for a younger model. Like what a beautiful marriage that would be. But here's the thing. I suspect the Pharisees were not just asking Jesus to pick a side in the debate. I suspect the Pharisees already knew what side Jesus would pick. After all, he had already given them his answer in the Sermon on the Mount. And so as the text tells us, they come not just to ask him this question, but to test him with it. But what is the test? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Is it lawful? You see that right there, that's the test. The test is about the law and the lawfulness of this. They confirm it a few verses later when they ask their follow-up question. Why then did Moses command that a man why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Their challenge to Jesus is about the law. They are asserting that his stance on divorce actually goes against the law, or he is a lawbreaker, or at least is teaching the law inappropriately, which is even worse. But Jesus, well, he seems to see this coming, and so he actually withholds his direct answer until the end, and instead he counters their upcoming challenge by quoting two passages from the beginning of Genesis. And it's as if Jesus is saying, is it lawful? Well, do you know what came even earlier than the law? How about creation? Well, what is creation trying to tell us? What is God's good design for marriage? Because ultimately, the law is focused on pointing us there. And so when they respond to this with the already defunct argument, what about the law? Well, I imagine Jesus shaking his head like I answered that already. But then he goes ahead and answers them anyways, offering yet another counter. He says, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. These laws were created because your hearts were hard. Remember my teaching of tying oranges onto the apple tree, right? We have hard hearts, need of circumcision of the heart. But then he restates more clearly the point he was making when he quoted Genesis. And he says, it was not this way from the beginning. So at this point, I just want to stop real quick and make sure we're all on the same page, bring everyone up to speed. Here's what we know. This was a big debate back then. Divorce and what allowed for a divorce. This was a big debate back then, and many of Jesus's fellow Jewish men listened to and agreed with the two rabbis who supported the interpretation that husbands were allowed to divorce their wives for seemingly any reason and every reason, including seeing a prettier girl. And so in their society and in their culture, this was an appropriate reading of the Jewish law, and thus it was a socially acceptable practice. It was considered legal, and so therefore it was considered okay. But Jesus disagreed and stood against this. But why? Right? We ask why. And I'm hoping all of us would at least see the obvious answer to this question. Because this was terrible for wives and women. And seriously, just think, this would be absolutely terrible if this was how we all viewed marriage and divorce today, and some even do. But just imagine how much worse it was back then. So Jesus is focused on men divorcing their wives, but doesn't mention a wife choosing to divorce her husband. And I'm not saying it didn't happen. Like, it did happen, it could happen, but it happened far, far less because of how the society back then was set up. Like, does anyone think that women back then had the ability to earn a living wage? Right? Do you think a girl, when she reached adulthood, she could just move out of her father's house and rent her own apartment and live alone? Like, if you think that, you are fooling yourself. Of course she couldn't support herself like that. So you see what's going on in a divorce back then is you have this man who is able to be self-sufficient and provide for himself, and one day he decides to take a wife. And so his wife leaves her father's household and comes to live with her husband at his father's household, and her husband loves and supports her, maybe, until one day she burns his toast. And he gets really mad about it. And so now she is walking on eggshells around him, constantly afraid that she will mess up again and he will kick her out to the curb. Until one day her increased efforts turn out to be all for naught because her husband caught eyes for some other woman, and so now either she is going to be divorced and sent packing, in which case she has a few options. She can, one, try to go live with a relative who likely will take her in begrudgingly. She has another mouth to feed. Why can't she support herself and stay married? And so she's going to be treated as little more than a servant. Or she will choose to find a new husband, who most likely will view her as damaged goods because she comes to him not a virgin. She comes to him as previously married and divorced. She is damaged good, and thus she will find herself in a degraded relationship with her new husband. Or, third option, she can become a prostitute who makes a living by being used and abused and dehumanized night after night. Or she could forgo all those because they're horrible, and she can instead choose to live on the streets and in the garbage dumps where she faces untold harm and abuse and likely dies a very early death. That's the situation. Or here's another option that she doesn't even get to decide. Or, seeing as men could take multiple wives back then, it was culturally acceptable, her husband might just hold on to her. Right? Her husband won't love her, not anymore, if he ever did in the first place. And instead, he will use her primarily for housekeeping and perhaps for acquiring a son to carry on his lineage. This is the situation that many women, even Jewish women, that many women who lived back then faced. So, do you know what Jesus says to the men of his culture? Jesus says, at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. And I'm not sure what all Jesus is intending to say here. There are debates. I'm not going to get into those. But at the very least, Jesus is referencing the time when God created men and women in the image of God. And at the very least, Jesus is using this to say that women and wives share fully in being images of God. They are not valued any less by God, and therefore we men, and the men back then, we cannot continue to treat them as lesser humans, and we men cannot continue to treat them as lesser images of God. It doesn't matter how culturally acceptable it is, or how legally acceptable we think it is, we cannot treat them this way. Now, obviously today, there is still some of that treatment going on, but I want you to remain grounded in the reality of back then and how much worse it was, because that's what Jesus is confronting. And so then Jesus, after bringing this up about their humanity and their co-image of Godness, well, then Jesus brings up another quote, and he says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." But here's the thing. That was never the practice in Israel. Upon marriage, a wife would leave her father's household and would then accompany her husband to his father's household. And for the first year, they would live in a honeymoon suite built onto the side of the husband's father's house that he had built for them. And so, women, if you're a woman, I want you to imagine living back then in that culture, where you were at best a second-class human, and now you are newly married to a husband you possibly barely knew to begin with, and now you have to leave behind your family and go spend at least your first year of marriage living in a room attached to your in-laws' house. So women, at this point, how vulnerable do you feel right now? Like, what if your husband's family doesn't like you very much? What if his mom and you don't get along and she is always in his ear bad-talking you? Or what if you struggle to get pregnant that first year? Or what if 5 years later you've only given him daughters? But you see, God, he tosses this little statement into Genesis chapter 2, and then Jesus later brings it up within this culture where that is what happens. And it's as if to say, hey, you men, you might not leave your father's house, but when you get married, your father and mother are no longer your primary family. Your wife is. She is now your top priority family member. She's not just some piece of luggage you returned home with. She is a fellow human being and a fellow image of God, and she is now your other half. The two of you together are one flesh, and therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate. And so, we might be like, okay, but then we want to join the chorus of Pharisees, and we want to say, why then? Why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Why make the law if that wasn't a good thing? And here's the thing. Hear this. If the husband doesn't want her anymore, but refuses to send her away, then she will be no better than a slave and a baby-making machine in his house. She might not even be his wife anymore. He might divorce her and keep her as a slave. So Moses is like, no, you have to send her away. But here's the thing. If he sends her away but does not provide her with a certificate of divorce, then she cannot prove that she is divorced. The husband doesn't have to. He can take multiple wives, but she needs to prove that she is not married anymore. She needs to prove that she is divorced, because if she can't prove it, and if she is found to be sleeping with anyone, such as a new husband, well, then she will be accused of adultery, and her accusers might stone her to death. So Moses permitted husbands to divorce their wives because their hearts were hard. AKA, the men were going to do it anyways. They were going to want to divorce their wives and either get rid of them or hold on to them as slaves, and they were just going to do it out of their own whims. They were going to divorce them, or they were going to treat them much worse, no matter what Moses or God had commanded them to do. However, then God, seeing this, God steps in and he works through Moses to put in certain stipulations and commands that were intended to at least offer some sort of protection for the women. Right? You have to send them away, and you have to provide them with a certificate proving that they are divorced. It was far from a perfect solution, but a perfect solution wasn't even available. But here's the thing that happens with that law. Over time, over the course of time, this grace-filled solution of a law gets twisted and misused, and it's debated by men in order to justify themselves and to defend their wicked actions. And they're like, I can divorce my wife for any and every reason, so long as I give her a certificate of divorce and send her away. And as long as I do that, it is okay. I can do whatever I want as far as divorce is concerned. And so do you know what Jesus says to these men? He says, I tell you that any man who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. And how do Jesus' own disciples respond? Well, they say, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. Like his own disciples' initial reaction is that they would rather not get married than be asked to remain faithful to their faithful wives. Like, that's how bad Jewish society seemingly was. It was so bad that Jesus' own disciples felt this was asking too much of them as men. Jesus wanted them to consider the other person. He wanted them to consider the well-being of the woman involved. He wanted them to not just kick her to the curb for any and every reason. He wanted them to remain steadfast in their oaths and their vows to their wives. He wanted them to love them and to care for them and to be committed to them. And this was somehow asking too much of them. And did you catch that one line of Jesus I just read a moment ago? Earlier, according to Jesus, the husband caused the woman to commit adultery. But it was the woman who committed adultery. But now here, Jesus changes it. And he says that the man who has divorced the wife is now the one who is said to be committing adultery. But then, what did Jesus mean to suggest earlier when he claimed that the original husband was forcing the woman to commit adultery? What did he mean? What was he saying? Now, Dallas Willard, a great book. It's called The Divine Conspiracy. You should read it. But in that book, he suggests that this is not meant to forbid divorce, this saying by Jesus, but instead it is to make clear what its effects are. So Willard points out what I have tried to make clear, that the vast majority of cases of divorce back then were devastating for the woman. Her life was simply ruined. Meanwhile, no real harm was done to the man, by contrast. So Dallas says that for the woman, to not marry again was a terrible prospect. It meant to grow old with no children, as well as with no social position, a perpetual failure as a human being. She can't even support herself. But on the other hand, to marry was to live in a degraded sexual relationship the rest of her life, because precious few husbands would allow her to forget it. And so when Jesus speaks of her being forced into adultery, he is pointing out the degraded sexual condition and societal position that was, at least back then, sure to be the result of divorce. Now, by this point, we're wrapping up. By this point, I hope you are getting what I am putting down about what I believe Jesus is putting down for us, his followers, to hear and do. But let's just say it clearly. I believe Jesus is telling us to protect women. So Jesus doesn't want men ogling, however you say it. He doesn't want us staring lustfully at women with our eyes. He says it to men. He says, I don't want you staring lustfully at women with your eyes. And Jesus doesn't want husbands mistreating wives and discarding them like they are second-class luggage. Instead, he wants them to treat them like they are our family and our other halves and our fellow images of God. But you see, of course, as with all his teachings, this teaching is not just about women, right? It's not just about divorce. He's also telling us to protect other vulnerable and oppressed, exploited groups and populations in addition to women. Do you need examples? Well, we'll think about women. Think of black people and foreigners. Think people who are poor, people with disabilities, people suffering from homelessness. Think people addicted to alcohol and drugs. Think sex workers. Think illegal immigrants. Jesus tells us to protect women and to protect these other groups and populations, to protect people from our own abuses and misuses of God's laws. Most of which were actually intended to protect these very same people rather than to attack them and condemn them. You see, back then, the disciples and their fellow Jews, they misused these laws to justify themselves and to make the mistreatment of women socially acceptable and legal. But we say that's back then, but like, how different has the church been since then throughout history? How different are we today? Do you want an example? Well, I think we drive past people holding signs asking for help. We just drive on past them because nobody actually expects us to stop and help them. It's socially acceptable to just keep on driving. Instead of helping them, we splurge on items we don't really need all that much because at least we spent less than the Joneses down the street. And once again, it's socially acceptable. And instead of helping feed those people who are in need, instead of helping feed them today, well, we put our money into savings accounts and Roth IRAs so that we can be even more comfortable tomorrow. And that sort of thing, it's just culturally acceptable even within our churches. Now, we wish that Jesus was only talking about divorce back in the day, because for many of us it'd be like, it doesn't apply to me. We wish Jesus was only confronting men and husbands who mistreat their wives using divorce laws. But he's not. Like ancient divorce rules and practices, they're just a prime example of what he is actually talking about, what he's actually trying to get at. He is also talking about some of the terrible things that we do today, many of which we've somehow blinded ourselves to the terribleness of. We've convinced ourselves that it is legal and therefore it is okay, but you see, it's not okay. It's like we have become the paparazzi who think it's okay to camp outside a celebrity's home and take pictures of their children as they head to school. But that's not okay. We're become like protesters who think it's okay to ruin a person's dinner as well as ruin their family's home life because we disagree with their opinion and their official vote. We are like those realtors back before the huge housing market crisis back in 2008. The realtors who were selling homes to people who realistically couldn't afford them just so they could make more money. Like sure, it's not necessarily illegal, but clearly it is wrong. Or at least it should be clear to us. And it would be clear to us if we actually have our eyes focused squarely on Jesus, crucified on the cross. You see, on the cross, we see Jesus respond to both the victims and their assailants. So to anyone who has ever been a victim, to anyone who has been made a victim, Jesus chooses to go up on the cross in order to join you as a victim. Jesus willingly chose to experience the brokenness that you yourself are going through, so that he can lead you out of it back into wholeness. He refuses to let you go through it alone, and he wants to help you heal and to find new life. But let's be absolutely clear. Jesus also refuses to let people keep hurting you. And so he also has a message for your assailants. And the reality is, all of us are assailants and attackers and sinners and people who have hurt other people. So Jesus' message here on the cross, it's to victims and it's to assailants and it's to all of us. All of us, to those of us who are assailants and sinners, which is all of us, Jesus chooses to go up on the cross in order to take the punishment that we deserve. And he goes up on the cross in order to forgive us for the terrible things we have done. Jesus willingly chose to experience the death that we have brought upon ourselves so that he can lead us out the other side back into life. But Jesus refuses to let us keep hurting others. So he wants to help us stop and to walk out a new life. So Jesus, here in these scriptures, he invites us to follow him and to become students of life. He invites us to be not just forgiven, but transformed, made new. He invites us to hear this good teaching and to do our best to obey it. And he invites us to new life and to a new way of living. And if you're looking for the gospel of Jesus, there it is. It's Jesus forgiving us and inviting us to a new life and a new way of living. Jesus did not come to attack divorced people. He came to protect women from societally accepted injustice. Jesus did not come to break up a bunch of second and third marriages. He came to encourage current married couples to be lovingly committed to one another and to persevere through tough times. Jesus did not come to judge us. He came to forgive us and to show a better way. Jesus did not come to condemn us. He came to die on the cross for our sins, and he came to lead us from death to life. Therefore, let's follow him today and every day moving forward. Amen.